The story of Sleeping Beauty that most people know today bears almost no resemblance to the dark, disturbing tales that originated centuries ago in European folklore. What we think of as a charming children's story about a princess who pricks her finger and falls into an enchanted sleep was once a collection of violent, sexually explicit narratives that served as cautionary tales for adults about the dangers lurking in medieval society. The transformation of these stories from their brutal origins to the sanitized versions we know today reveals not just the evolution of storytelling, but the changing values, fears, and moral frameworks of entire civilizations. The earliest known version of what would eventually become Sleeping Beauty appears in Giambattista Basile's collection, Il Pentamerone, published in 1636. Basile's tale, titled Sun, Moon, and Talia, contains elements so disturbing that they would be completely unrecognizable to anyone familiar with modern adaptations. In this original version, there is no spinning wheel, no fairy godmothers, and certainly no awakening kiss from a noble prince. Instead, the story begins with a king who receives a prophecy that his daughter Talia will be killed by a splinter of flax. Despite his efforts to protect her by removing all flax from the kingdom, Talia eventually encounters an old woman spinning and is indeed pierced by a flax splinter, falling into what appears to be death. Rather than being placed in a glass coffin or enchanted castle, Talia's father, believing her dead, abandons her body in one of his country estates, placing her on a velvet throne and sealing the palace forever. Years later, another king discovers the abandoned palace while hunting. Finding the beautiful woman who appears to be sleeping, he attempts to wake her, but when his efforts fail, he commits what can only be described as sexual assault, leaving her pregnant before departing. 9 months later, still unconscious, Talia gives birth to twins who are cared for by invisible fairies. One of the infants, searching for milk, sucks on Talia's finger and draws out the flax splinter, finally awakening her. The story becomes even more horrifying when the king returns and discovers Talia awake with his children. Rather than being horrified by his actions, he is delighted and begins a relationship with her. However, his wife discovers the affair and orders her cook to kill the children and serve them to her husband for dinner. The cook, taking pity on the innocents, hides the children and serves goat meat instead. When the queen's deception is discovered, she attempts to burn Talia alive, but the king arrives just in time to save her and instead burns his wife to death. The story concludes with the king marrying Talia and living happily ever after with their children. This version of the tale reflects the harsh realities of medieval life, where women had little agency over their own bodies and sexual violence was often overlooked or minimized. The story served multiple functions in its original context. It warned of the dangers that could befall unprotected women, reinforced the idea that women's primary value lay in their ability to bear children, and demonstrated the consequences of adultery and jealousy. The cannibalistic elements reflected real fears about infanticide and the vulnerability of children in a world where infant mortality was devastatingly high. The symbolic elements in Basile's version are deeply rooted in ancient fertility myths and coming-of-age rituals. The spinning wheel, which would become central to later versions, represents the wheel of fate and the transition from maidenhood to womanhood. The pricking of the finger has been interpreted by scholars as a metaphor for menstruation and sexual awakening, while the long sleep represents the liminal period between childhood and adulthood. The awakening through childbirth emphasizes the medieval belief that a woman's true purpose was fulfilled only through motherhood. When Charles Perrault adapted the story in 1697 for his collection, Tales of Mother Goose, he made significant changes that began the process of sanitization while still retaining many disturbing elements. Perrault's version, titled The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, introduced the spinning wheel curse and the 100-year sleep that would become standard in later adaptations. In his telling, a princess is cursed by a malevolent fairy to prick her finger on a spindle and die, but a good fairy modifies the curse so that she will only sleep for 100 years until awakened by a prince's kiss. Perrault's version eliminates the rape and unconscious childbirth, replacing them with a consensual romance after the princess awakens. However, the story doesn't end with their marriage. Instead, it continues with a second part that proves almost as disturbing as Basile's original. After marrying the princess and having 2 children with her, the prince must hide his family from his mother, who happens to be an ogress with cannibalistic tendencies. When the prince becomes king and goes to war, his mother attempts to eat her grandchildren and daughter-in-law, ordering the cook to prepare them with special sauce. Like in Basile's version, the cook substitutes animal meat. But the ogress eventually discovers the deception and prepares to throw the family into a pit filled with vipers and other deadly creatures. Only the timely return of the king saves them, and his mother, in her rage, throws herself into the pit instead. Perrault's adaptation reflects the sensibilities of the French court under Louis XIV, where tales of magic and enchantment were popular entertainment among the aristocracy. His version introduces the concept of fairy godmothers and magical intervention, moving the story away from pure folklore toward the realm of literary fairy tale. The spinning wheel becomes a central symbol, representing both domestic duty and hidden danger. The curse itself reflects contemporary anxieties about the transition from childhood to adulthood, particularly for young women whose marriages were often arranged and whose futures were entirely dependent on their families' political and economic considerations. The symbolic interpretation of Perrault's version focuses heavily on themes of sexual awakening and the dangers of premature exposure to adult knowledge. The spinning wheel, traditionally associated with women's work and domestic life, becomes a forbidden object that represents the adult world that the young princess is not yet ready to enter. Her curiosity leads to her downfall, reinforcing contemporary beliefs about the dangers of female independence and the importance of parental guidance and protection. The 100-year sleep can be interpreted as a metaphor for the period of adolescence, during which a young woman must remain pure and protected until she is ready for marriage and motherhood. The prince's kiss represents not just romantic love, but the socially sanctioned transition into adult sexuality and domestic responsibility. The fact that the princess awakens at exactly the right moment, when she is mature enough for marriage and when a suitable husband appears, reinforces the idea that women's lives should be entirely governed by external forces rather than personal choice. The brothers Grimm further sanitized the story in their collection of German folk tales, first published in 1812 and revised multiple times throughout the 19th century. Their version, Little Briar Rose, eliminates the cannibalistic second part entirely and focuses solely on the sleeping curse and its resolution. In the Grimm version, the curse is cast by a 13th fairy who was not invited to the princess's christening because there were only 12 golden plates in the kingdom. The curse condemns the princess to prick her finger on a spindle and die, but the 12th fairy, who had not yet given her blessing, modifies it to a 100-year sleep. The Grimm brothers made several significant changes that reflected 19th century German values and Protestant moral sensibilities. They emphasized the importance of hospitality and social inclusion by making the curse result from the slight of not inviting the 13th fairy. They also added the detail of the thorny hedge that grows around the castle, killing any prince who attempts to reach the princess before the appointed time. This addition serves multiple symbolic purposes, representing both the protective barrier that preserves the princess's purity and the idea that timing is crucial in matters of love and marriage. The hedge of thorns that surrounds the sleeping castle becomes roses when the right prince arrives at the destined moment, symbolizing the transformation of danger into beauty, of barrier into welcome. This detail reflects Romantic-era ideals about true love conquering all obstacles and the belief that fate guides worthy individuals toward their destined partners. The princes who die attempting to reach the castle before the appointed time represent the dangers of impatience and the importance of waiting for divine timing. In the Grimm version, the princess is given the name Briar Rose, connecting her directly to the thorny hedge and emphasizing her dual nature as both beautiful and protected, approachable and dangerous. The name also evokes the wild rose, which blooms briefly and beautifully but is surrounded by sharp thorns, serving as a metaphor for female sexuality that must be carefully approached and properly cultivated. The Grimm brothers' multiple revisions of their collection show how the story continued to evolve throughout the 19th century in response to changing social attitudes. Early editions contained more violence and sexual content, but later revisions increasingly emphasized moral lessons and removed elements deemed inappropriate for children. This process of ongoing sanitization reflects the gradual transformation of fairy tales from adult entertainment to children's literature, a change that fundamentally altered both their content and their cultural function. The Victorian era brought about the most significant transformation in how Sleeping Beauty was understood and presented. During this period, fairy tales became primarily associated with childhood, and publishers began producing lavishly illustrated children's books that emphasized the magical and romantic elements while completely eliminating any disturbing content. The story became a celebration of passive femininity, patient waiting, and the transformative power of true love. Victorian interpretations of Sleeping Beauty emphasized the princess's purity and innocence, presenting her long sleep as a period of preservation rather than vulnerability. The spinning wheel became a symbol of domestic industry and the dangers that could arise from straying from proper feminine pursuits. The curse represented the perils that awaited young women who ventured beyond the protected sphere of family supervision, while the prince's rescue demonstrated the importance of male protection and guidance. The Victorian fascination with death, like sleep, also reflected contemporary anxieties about catalepsy, a medical condition that could cause people to fall into coma, like states that resembled death. Medical knowledge was still limited, and there were documented cases of people being buried alive after falling into cataleptic states. The idea of a beautiful woman lying in death, like sleep, for years captured the Victorian imagination and fed into romanticized notions about death, beauty, and preservation. During this period, the story began to be interpreted through increasingly psychological and symbolic lenses. The spinning wheel was seen as representing the wheel of fortune, or the cycle of life and death. The princess's sleep was interpreted as a metaphor for the unconscious mind, or the period of adolescent development, during which a young woman's sexuality remains dormant until awakened by appropriate circumstances. The prince's kiss became the catalyst for psychological as well as physical awakening. The transformation of Sleeping Beauty from Bazile's brutal tale of assault and cannibalism to the Victorian celebration of pure love and patient waiting demonstrates how storytelling serves as a mirror for societal values and anxieties. Each version of the tale reflects the specific concerns of its historical moment while addressing universal themes about growing up, sexuality, danger, and protection. The evolution of the story shows how cultures adapt ancient narratives to serve contemporary needs while gradually obscuring their original meanings and purposes. The process of sanitization was not merely about making stories appropriate for children, but about reshaping cultural narratives to support particular social structures and moral frameworks. By removing the sexual violence from the original tales, later versions eliminated important warnings about the vulnerability of women in patriarchal societies. By emphasizing passive waiting and male rescue, they reinforced gender roles that limited women's agency and independence. The transformation of Sleeping Beauty thus represents not just literary evolution, but ideological manipulation of cultural memory. Modern psychological interpretations of the Sleeping Beauty story have identified numerous symbolic elements that persist across all versions despite surface changes. The pricking of the finger represents the onset of menstruation and sexual maturity, marking the transition from childhood to womanhood. The long sleep symbolizes the liminal period of adolescence, during which young people are neither children nor adults, but exist in a suspended state between the two. The awakening represents not just physical maturation, but psychological integration and the acceptance of adult sexuality and responsibility. The spinning wheel itself carries multiple layers of symbolic meaning that have persisted throughout the story's evolution. As a tool associated with women's work, it represents domestic duty and the proper sphere of feminine activity. As a circular object, it symbolizes the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. The act of spinning transforms raw materials into finished products, paralleling the transformation of girls into women and the creation of new life through sexual union and childbirth. The castle that falls under the sleeping spell represents the protected domestic sphere that surrounds and preserves feminine innocence. The hedge of thorns that grows around it symbolizes both the barriers that protect women from premature exposure to adult sexuality and the difficulties that must be overcome to achieve mature relationships. The fact that the hedge becomes roses for the destined prince represents the transformation that occurs when protection gives way to appropriate intimacy. Contemporary feminist scholars have criticized traditional interpretations of Sleeping Beauty for promoting passive femininity and dependence on male rescue. They argue that the story teaches girls to wait for others to solve their problems rather than taking active roles in shaping their own destinies. The princess's complete passivity during her enchanted sleep has been seen as a metaphor for the social expectation that women should remain inactive and dependent until marriage provides them with purpose and identity. However, other scholars have argued that the story can be read as a celebration of feminine power and the importance of proper timing in personal development. From this perspective, the princess's sleep is not passive waiting, but active preparation, a period during which she develops the maturity necessary for adult relationships and responsibilities. The curse that causes her sleep can be seen as protection rather than punishment, preserving her from premature exposure to dangers she is not yet equipped to handle. The enduring popularity of Sleeping Beauty across cultures and centuries suggests that it addresses fundamental human concerns about growing up, sexuality, and the passage from innocence to experience. Despite the radical changes in its surface narrative, the story continues to resonate because it explores universal themes about vulnerability, protection, transformation, and the complex relationship between danger and desire. The evolution from Bazile's brutal tale to modern Disney adaptations shows how each generation reshapes ancient stories to reflect its own values while preserving essential symbolic elements that speak to timeless human experiences. The historical journey of Sleeping Beauty, from disturbing folklore to sanitized fairy tale, reveals not just the evolution of storytelling, but the changing relationship between narrative and social control. The original versions served as warnings about real dangers in medieval society, while later adaptations became tools for reinforcing particular moral and social values. Understanding this evolution helps us recognize how stories shape and are shaped by the cultures that tell them, and how the sanitization of dark tales can sometimes obscure important truths about human nature and social reality. The story of Sleeping Beauty is far from unique in its transformation from adult cautionary tale to children's entertainment. Many of the fairy tales we now consider appropriate for young audiences began as much darker narratives that addressed adult concerns about sexuality, violence, and social survival. The process by which these stories were sanitized reflects broader cultural changes in attitudes toward childhood, sexuality, and the function of narrative in society. By examining the original versions alongside their modern adaptations, we can better understand both the stories themselves and the cultures that have shaped and reshaped them over time. As we move beyond the literary evolution of Sleeping Beauty, we encounter an even more fascinating question about whether this enduring tale might have roots in actual historical events. Throughout European history, there have been documented cases of mysterious sleeping sicknesses, unexplained comas, and cataleptic states that bear striking similarities to the enchanted sleep described in fairy tales. These real-world phenomena may have provided the factual foundation upon which generations of storytellers built their increasingly elaborate fictional narratives. Medieval chronicles and historical records contain numerous accounts of individuals who fell into death, like sleeps that lasted for months or even years. In the 14th century, during the height of the Black Death, European physicians documented cases of what they called sleeping sickness that affected entire communities. Victims would fall into profound comas from which they could not be awakened, yet they continued to breathe and showed signs of life. Some recovered spontaneously after weeks or months, while others remained in these states until death. The medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to explain these phenomena, leading to supernatural interpretations that may have influenced the development of sleeping curse narratives. One of the most thoroughly documented historical cases occurred in the French village of Pont, Saint-Esprit in the 15th century, where an entire family fell into mysterious comas that lasted for several months. The local physician recorded detailed observations of their condition, noting that they appeared to be in a state between life and death, unresponsive to physical stimuli, but showing subtle signs of awareness. When they finally awakened, they claimed to have experienced vivid dreams and visions during their sleep, describing otherworldly encounters that the physician interpreted as divine revelations. This case became legendary in the region and may have contributed to the development of local folklore about enchanted sleep. The phenomenon of catalepsy, a medical condition characterized by muscular rigidity and fixity of posture, was poorly understood in medieval times and often mistaken for death. People suffering from cataleptic episodes could remain motionless for hours or days, with barely detectable breathing and heartbeat. In an era before modern medical knowledge, such conditions would have seemed supernatural, particularly when victims eventually recovered with no apparent ill effects. Historical records from various European countries contain accounts of people who were presumed dead and prepared for burial, only to awaken at the last moment or even after being placed in their coffins. The famous case of Margery MacColl, known as the Lady with the Ring, occurred in Ireland in the 17th century and became part of local folklore that shares elements with Sleeping Beauty narratives. MacColl fell into a death-like state and was buried with her valuable wedding ring, which her husband could not remove from her swollen finger. Grave robbers later attempted to steal the ring by cutting off her finger, but the pain caused her to awaken from her cataleptic state. She returned home to find her husband remarried, creating a scandal that was remembered for generations and may have influenced local storytelling traditions. Medieval medical texts describe various conditions that could cause prolonged unconsciousness, resembling the enchanted sleep of fairy tales. Physicians of the time wrote about lethargia, a condition characterized by profound sleepiness and unresponsiveness that could last for extended periods. They also documented cases of morbus commissalis, now known as epilepsy, which could cause patients to fall into post-ictal states lasting days or weeks. Without modern understanding of neurological conditions, these medical phenomena were often attributed to supernatural causes, including curses, divine punishment, or demonic possession. The historical record also contains accounts of individuals who claim to have prophetic abilities during periods of prolonged unconsciousness, similar to the oracular traditions associated with sleeping figures in ancient mythology. In medieval Europe, there were documented cases of people who fell into trance-like states during which they were believed to receive divine visions or communicate with spiritual entities. These individuals often became local celebrities and pilgrimage destinations, with people traveling great distances to witness their supernatural sleep and hear their prophecies when they occasionally awakened. Ergot poisoning, caused by consuming grain contaminated with the ergot fungus, could produce symptoms that might have contributed to sleeping curse legends. Ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire, could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and in some cases, prolonged periods of altered consciousness that resembled enchanted sleep. During times of poor harvest or grain storage, entire communities could be affected by ergot poisoning, leading to mass outbreaks of mysterious symptoms that medieval people would have interpreted as supernatural curses or divine punishment. The connection between Sleeping Beauty and real castles throughout Europe adds another layer of historical authenticity to the legend. Many medieval castles have rooms or towers that were sealed off and abandoned for various reasons, creating the perfect setting for stories about sleeping princesses waiting to be discovered. Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, though built much later than the medieval period, was specifically designed to evoke fairy tale imagery and has become associated with Sleeping Beauty in popular culture. However, older castles with more authentic historical connections to the legend can be found throughout Germany, France, and other European countries. Château de Ussé in France's Loire Valley is often cited as a possible inspiration for Charles Perrault's version of Sleeping Beauty. The castle's distinctive architecture, with its towers and turrets rising above the surrounding forest, matches descriptions found in various versions of the tale. Local legends associated with the castle include stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena that may have influenced Perrault's writing. The castle's history includes periods of abandonment and restoration that could have given rise to stories about sleeping inhabitants waiting to be awakened. Dormer Sennschloss Sababerg in Germany, known as the Sleeping Beauty Castle, has the strongest historical claim to connection with the Brothers Grimm version of the tale. The castle, built in the 14th century, fell into ruin over the centuries and became overgrown with thorny vegetation, creating a natural parallel to the hedge of thorns described in the fairy tale. The Grimm brothers were familiar with the region and may have visited the ruins during their collection of folk tales. Local traditions associated the castle with stories of enchanted sleep long before the Grimms recorded their version of Briar Rose. Archaeological evidence from various European castle sites has revealed chambers that were deliberately sealed and abandoned, sometimes containing personal belongings that suggest hasty departures. These discoveries have fueled speculation about the historical basis for stories of sleeping inhabitants who might one day return. While most of these sealed chambers likely resulted from practical considerations such as structural damage or political upheaval, their mysterious nature has contributed to the folklore surrounding castles and sleeping curses. The medical understanding of sleep disorders has evolved dramatically since medieval times, but historical accounts of unusual sleep patterns and conditions provide insight into the possible origins of Sleeping Beauty legends. Kleine-Levin syndrome, also known as Sleeping Beauty syndrome, is a rare neurological disorder characterized by recurring periods of excessive sleepiness and altered behavior. While this condition was not formally identified until the 20th century, historical descriptions of similar symptoms can be found in medieval medical texts, suggesting that such cases may have contributed to folklore about enchanted sleep. Encephalitis lethargica, also known as sleeping sickness, caused a pandemic between 1915 and 1926, but historical accounts suggest that similar conditions may have occurred in earlier periods. This viral infection affects the brain and can cause patients to fall into profound sleep states lasting weeks, months, or even years. Some patients would awaken spontaneously with no apparent ill effects, while others remained in vegetative states or died. The dramatic nature of this condition, with its sudden onset and unpredictable recovery, would have seemed supernatural to medieval observers and could easily have inspired stories of enchanted sleep. The role of poisoning in creating death, like states, has been documented throughout history and may have provided another factual basis for Sleeping Beauty legends. Various plant and mineral toxins can cause symptoms ranging from deep unconsciousness to cataleptic rigidity that mimics death. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, contains alkaloids that can cause prolonged unconsciousness, while other plants like mandrake were historically used to induce sleep, like states for medical procedures. Knowledge of these substances was often closely guarded by physicians, herbalists, and others who might have used them for both beneficial and malicious purposes. Historical records from medieval Europe include numerous accounts of suspected poisoning cases where victims fell into unexplained comas or death-like states. Court chronicles often describe mysterious illnesses affecting nobles and royalty, with symptoms that included prolonged unconsciousness, cataleptic rigidity, and eventual recovery or death. While many of these cases were likely due to natural causes or known diseases, the lack of medical understanding at the time led to supernatural explanations that may have influenced the development of sleeping curse narratives. The practice of medieval medicine included the use of various substances that could induce deep sleep or unconsciousness, some of which were derived from plants that appear in fairy tale imagery. The poppy, source of opium, was known to medieval physicians and appears in various forms throughout European folklore associated with sleep and dreams. Mandrake root, with its anthropomorphic shape and powerful psychoactive properties, was believed to have magical properties and appears in numerous medieval texts dealing with enchantment and supernatural sleep. Monastic records from medieval Europe contain detailed accounts of individuals who experienced what were described as divine trances or mystical sleep states. These religious experiences often involved prolonged periods of unconsciousness, during which the subjects were believed to receive visions or communicate with divine entities. Saint Catherine of Siena, for example, was known to fall into trance-like states that could last for hours or days, during which she appeared to be in a death-like sleep but would eventually awaken with accounts of spiritual revelations. Such cases provided religious context for stories about supernatural sleep and awakening. The historical connection between spinning and women's lives in medieval Europe adds authenticity to the symbolic elements found in Sleeping Beauty narratives. Spinning was not only a crucial economic activity, but also a social and cultural practice that defined women's roles and relationships. The spinning wheel, introduced to Europe in the 13th century, revolutionized textile production and became a central feature of women's daily lives. The association between spinning and female identity was so strong that unmarried women were called spinsters, a term that persisted long after the economic importance of spinning declined. Medieval guilds that controlled textile production were often exclusively male organizations, while women typically worked as individual spinners in their homes or small workshops. This economic arrangement created tensions and conflicts that may have influenced the development of folklore about spinning and its associated dangers. Stories about cursed spinning wheels or enchanted spindles could reflect real anxieties about women's economic roles and the potential consequences of their participation in textile production. The symbolic connection between spinning and fate appears in numerous mythological and folkloric traditions throughout Europe, suggesting ancient origins for the association between spinning wheels and supernatural power. The three fates of classical mythology were depicted as spinners who controlled human destiny by spinning, measuring, and cutting the threads of life. This imagery persisted in medieval European culture and may have influenced the development of stories about spinning wheels that could determine a person's fate through curses or enchantments. Historical records from various European regions document actual accidents and injuries associated with spinning wheels and other textile equipment. Sharp spindles could cause serious wounds, and the repetitive nature of spinning work could lead to various health problems. In an era when medical treatment was limited and infection was often fatal, injuries from spinning equipment could indeed prove deadly, providing a factual basis for stories about the dangers associated with these tools. The social and economic importance of textile production in medieval Europe meant that disruptions to spinning and weaving could have serious consequences for entire communities. Historical accounts describe instances where disease, war, or other calamities affected textile workers, leading to economic hardship and social upheaval. Stories about cursed spinning wheels that brought sleep or death to entire kingdoms may reflect cultural memories of such disruptions and their far-reaching effects. The historical evolution of Sleeping Beauty from possible factual origins through literary adaptation to modern interpretation reveals the complex relationship between reality and narrative in human culture. While we cannot definitively prove that any specific historical event inspired the original Sleeping Beauty tales, the abundance of documented cases involving mysterious sleep states, cataleptic conditions, and spinning-related accidents suggests that these stories may have roots in actual human experiences. The transformation of these possible historical foundations into elaborate fairy tales demonstrates how cultures process and preserve collective memory through storytelling, gradually mythologizing real events until they become archetypal narratives that speak to universal human concerns about vulnerability, protection, and transformation.